So what are the things that we're going to have to do here in order to make this into a private page? There's a whole bunch of steps we're going to have to take.
Create a user ID and a password.
Okay, yeah, so we will. And where will we need to create that? Where are we going to store the user IDs and passwords?
On the form page.
Yeah, so we're going to have to set up a space in the database to hold our user accounts. Okay. Then we're going to have to create a page so that we can create a new user account in the database. Yeah? What else will we have to do? So we're going to do both of those things today. What else do you think we're going to have to do? We can create users in our database. Is that automatically going to make this page private?
Oh, no. You need to set a session variable.
Okay.
If that session variable is set, only then will you show this page, otherwise you don't.
Okay, so we're going to need a check on this page, whether we know who the user is, yes or no. How are we going to identify who the user is? I think, John, you were going to maybe suggest it.
You can use the email or one of the fields and set it to a variable in the session and check whether it's set. Okay,
yep. So we're going to need some kind of page in between. We're going to have a register page. We're going to have a users table in the database. We're going to have a security check on this page before we show this code. What will a user have to do in order to identify themselves so we know who they are? We're going to have to also build a login page and a page that will check the logins. So before we can secure this page, we need a table in our database, a register form, a save register page, a login form, and a validate login page. So we're going to need 4 PHP pages. We're going to need a table in our database. Once we have all of that set up, then we can add code at the top that will say, hey, do we know who this user is, yes or no? If we know who the user is, we're going to let them see our list of athletes. What should we do if the user tries to load this page and we don't know who they are? Right, that's typically what would happen, right? If I'm in Blackboard, I'm logged in here, but if I want to take the URL I'm on currently, everything in Blackboard's private, right? The login is basically the only public page. You can't get anywhere in Blackboard. So if I try and go here, what do you expect I'm going to see? So it's going to take me back here. So our workflow looks something like this. So the user asks for a page. So in this case, they might want they might want our athletes page for our list. They might want the athlete form so they could add or edit. Doesn't matter. All the pages, the user can request one. So I type in a URL, the web server. If it finds a page with that name, it sends the page back. But before we show the user the page, we've got this decision to make. Is our user authenticated, yes or no? Do we know who this person is? Okay. So we need a way to check who they are, and Yash mentioned how one of the ways we can do that using the session object. We'll talk about sessions today. So if we know who they are, we're going to show the page content. If we don't know who they are, we're going to do exactly what we just saw with Blackboard. We're going to kick the user back to the login page. We saw last week how to do a simple redirection in PHP. We're going to give the user a form. I think it doesn't take too much imagination to figure out what the login form is going to look like. You're going to build. We take their credentials, and then we have to send them to the database, and we've got to do a check. And now you've got another decision to make, right? Did we find their username password combination in our user table, yes or no? If we don't find them, we've got to tell them their login's no good, and we have to send them back so that they could try and log in again. If we do find them, and this is an important step, and Yash, this is what you mentioned, I think Yash and John, you were both mentioning this. Before we take them back to the other page that they wanted to see, we need to store their identity. Why do we need to store their identity before we let them leave and go to a different page? When we find somebody, we say, okay, Fred, there's your username, there's your password, so your user ID 800. We know who you are when you've logged in. Now, before you go to another page, we better store that user number, that identity, or your email. Why?
Because we can check if it's stored, and if it's not stored, that's how we can determine whether they're logged in or not.
That's true, but why is it important when they go to another page? Why do we have to, once we identify who they are, why do we need to store that user identity before they go off to a different page?
You want to show the content only related to that user?
Okay, could be. It could be. Here's an exam question for you. You might want to write this down. The reason we need to store the identity is because HTTP the HTTP protocol, the web is a stateless medium. Anybody have an idea what that means, the fact that it's stateless?
Every time a new page loads, it's blank, but there's no information.
That's right. Information does not persist from one HTTP request to the next one. So we can build a login page. We'll call our form, we're going to call our form login.php. And that form will post to a page we're going to call validate.php. So validate is what will do this checking. Did we find Fred's username and password in the database, yes or no? So when we're on validate, we know who Fred is. The problem is Fred is not interested in staying on the validate page. Fred wants to go here. As soon as we leave the validate page, if we don't store who he is first, as soon as he goes to another page, this page is going to come up and say, do we know who this user is?
No.
Nope. If we don't store his ID, where's he going to go?
Back to login.
Right back to the login page. So he's going to keep typing in his login and say, I know I'm putting in the right login. Why do I keep getting sent back to the login page? Because the web is stateless, once we identify our users after logging in, we need to store who they are. Okay? So this is kind of like having a passport, right? You're going to a new country. Before they let you cross the border, they're going to check your credential. Once you have that credential, they'll let you go anywhere you want inside of the country, but you've got to have a valid passport first. Okay? So we're going to have to make sure that we store that user identity before we let them go anywhere else. And we have two ways of doing it, and we'll talk about this a bit more. Session is one way. What's our other option besides a session?
A cookie?
Yeah, the other thing we could use is a cookie. Now we could use both, and we'll look at some sites that use both sessions and cookies, and we'll talk about some of the differences. Some sites will use both, some will use one, some will use the other.
Why would you use a cookie when the user can point to it?
Well, we'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. Okay. So we typically we'll use sessions. Cookies are another option. They're not as good of an option, and we'll see why in a little bit. Okay. So we're going to want to store who this user is before they leave. Now, Yash, you mentioned an interesting question. The other reason we want to store them is because we also might have different permissions, right? If you guys look in the Lesson 6 folder in Blackboard, we don't see the exact same things, do we? What things do you see on my version of Blackboard that you don't see if you're on the exact same page as me? We're both authenticated users.
Like those content and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so right here, you don't have this, right? If I want to see this page the way you see it, if I click that button, now I see the page the way you do. Or at least I think this is how you see it. So one of the things we want to be clear about, hint, another exam question coming, is the difference between authentication and authorization. Okay, they're related concepts, but they're different. So authentication is all about identity. Who is the user? Okay? And in our case, basically, we don't really care who you are. We need to know You're in our users table or you're not. If you're anybody in our users table, we're going to let you in. You have a username and password in our database. You're good. If otherwise, you're an anonymous user, and we're going to keep our pages private. So authentication is all about just figuring out who is this person who's trying to use our application. Authorization is what you were suggesting and what we see in Blackboard here. Authorization has to do with rights and permissions. What can a specific user or type of user do in the application? Right? So all of us are authenticated users in Blackboard. If we log in, we all have a credential. But we have different permissions because we're in different roles. You're in a student role, I'm in a faculty role. Right? There are other people who would be in administrator roles who have additional functionality in Blackboard that I don't see. They could do other things, like create new user accounts. I don't have that ability. Reset your passwords. I don't have that ability. Okay. So there's an authorization script that runs on this page that says something like, checks the session, because probably when we log in, not only does it store our identities, it also stores what type of user we are, or our role. So on this page, they're checking the session object to see, is this user in a faculty role or in a student role? If you're in a student role, this is hidden. If you're in a faculty role, it displays that section of the page so I can change it. Or you don't have these little drop downs here. Right? I get this little context menu. So again, that's to do with the authorization. What type of user am I? And should I be able to see that function, or should it be hidden from me because I'm not authorized? We're not really going to deal with authorization in this course. So authorization is sort of the second level of security. The first level is just authentication. We control, based on a username and password, who can get in and see our application or parts of it. Okay. Authorization is then who can do, of our existing users, who's allowed to do what. We probably aren't going to cover that in this course. Right? You guys will cover that stuff later on in your second year. I think you've got a web application security course, or that may be in third year with Tom. Okay. So this is kind of a handy diagram. I'm going to keep this up and we'll refer back to it through the class to get an idea of where we're going. Any questions so far? I mean, you've all logged into websites a million times, so now you get to play the other side of it. Today you're going to see how do we actually build that out. Okay, so what I want to do, we talked about sessions and cookies. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do a little research on your own, and I'll compile a list together as a class with your notes, and we'll put them on Blackboard. So here's what I want you to find out. What is a session? What is a cookie? How are they different? And how do we use them for authentication? Okay? So take 5 minutes, do a little research, we'll talk about it, and we'll make some notes as a class.
Cookies to securely make a login, because sites like Facebook, they don't obviously set the user ID through a cookie. Right?
Okay, that's a really good question. There's sort of two questions in one there. So typically, if sessions time out, so that means if we load a page, we make a request, and we don't make another request, we don't hit refresh or click a button for 15 or 20 minutes, if we're logged in with the session, we're going to wind up going back to the login screen. I'll tell you a great story about this in a minute. Okay. We can override that setting. So you can increase the session timeout in the site's configuration. So just because the web server will default to 15 or 20 minutes for a session, you can override it. So if you're building an application and your client or your boss says users need to be able to stay logged in even if they're inactive, you can just change the timeout setting. So that's one way around it.
What's the maximum time you can give?
I don't know that there is a maximum,
So
really. it's but it's not a great idea. Why is it not a great idea? Why do we not want to extend the session timeouts for too long?
Puts pressure on the server.
Security.
Right. If we leave people logged in, that means if they're logged in and they get up and leave their computer, they're still logged in, right? With a cookie, by default, you're logged in for 365 days most of the time. With a session, well, there's only a 15 or 20-minute window if you walked away from your machine when you're still going to be logged in, and it's going to time out. So it's more secure, so we don't really want to override that unless we have to. Here's the when you have to. Lesson number 1 in how to make your clients angry. Build a really, really, really big form that takes them lots of time to fill out. Keep the session timeout at 15 or 20 minutes. So somebody will open your form, so they make a request, right? I want to fill out the form. I had a client do this. It was an agency of the provincial government. And they had to record, I don't have the form, I think my login is, I don't think I can get in anymore to the site. For somebody to fill out that one form, literally they might spend 3 or 4 hours. They had to put in all this information, had to be both English and French, and there was a huge financial section, had to put in all these financial figures, do all these calculations. And when we first built the application, we had users, we didn't realize how long it took them to fill out the form until we started getting angry phone calls. I spent all morning filling out the form. It took me 4 hours. And I hit save at the bottom, and what did I get? Login screen. Because the session timed out, and the web was saved, so we didn't save anything. And they wasted half a day. So we learned to increase the session timeout. Not only that, we also did this. You can also do this. Here's a script, notice on Air Canada. So I'll show you what they do in terms of a timeout. You've probably seen this. Let's say we're going to take a trip. Where are we going to go on reading week? Pick a spot. Okay, let's go to Las Vegas. Good choice. So we're going, a week in Vegas should be good. We'll be in good shape when we come back. Now they're using the session timeout, and they're smart here, and we actually added this to the site once we started getting angry users. So let's go to Vegas. Now watch what they'll do here, right? They're showing the user, hey, this is going to expire if you don't do something. Okay, so we did 3 things to prevent this problem. We increased the session timeout to 4 hours because it defaulted to 20 minutes. We put on a timer here. We put it in the header with a countdown. Here's how much time you have left. The other thing, the form was so long, we broke it into sections, and we actually put a save button in each section. So they could save and continue, because every time they hit save, it interacts with the server. That reactivates the session. So they don't time out anytime they're requesting or reloading the page. So this is something to think about if you're going to build a really long form that's really complicated and take the user a long time to fill out. You're going to have to figure out ways to not let them time out and also make it easy for them to go through it without timing out.
How did changing so dynamically?
They're just using JavaScript, I think. So we did the same. And when we got down to 1 minute left, we popped up a message saying, you only have 1 minute left. Do you want to continue working, yes or no? And we let the user. So we learned that the hard way. They weren't very happy with us when we did that. Okay. So to come back to your question, I'm sorry, John, that was a too long-winded of an answer. We can increase the timeout. That's one option. Now, sites like Facebook, they use both sessions and cookies, right? How do we know when they're using a session and when they're using a cookie? If I go to Facebook, oh, we haven't seen Herb's log in for a while. So if I log in here, if I click log in, are they using a session or a cookie? If I just click log in right now. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do it here because I can close Chrome. Everybody said, most of you said session. Why did you say session? You're right. What gives you the idea that it's going to use a session? Good guess. Well, let's see, I'll log in. So I'm logged in. So if I close Chrome and reopen it and go back to Facebook, am I going to get the login screen again, or am I going to get my profile? Am I going to get my news feed?
Newsfeed.
Who says I'm going to get the home page?
If you stay signed,
You're
It's
gonna
an
need,
option.
there's an option
Yeah,
to
you're
comment
gonna get
on
there.
it, let's say your password.
yeah.
Why did I get the home screen?
You didn't.
You have it with the same password.
Okay, so I can log in without it, right? So in this case, it's using a session. I'm active now in Facebook. I can go from page to page. It knows who I am. But as soon as I close my browser, I've killed that session. So now when I go back here, it's lost my identity. I've got to log in again. Okay? What's checking the box going to do?
It's gonna set a cookie.
It's going to set a cookie that, as Mayank said, will go across browser session. So I said keep me logged in. Now I can close the browser, go back to Chrome. I'm still logged in. Which of these is more secure?
Session.
Right. How many of you check that checkbox that says keep me logged in?
Everything I do.
Yeah, today should be the last day you ever do that.
But no one else uses my computer, so.
Is it a desktop computer?
Yeah.
Certainly on any kind of portable computer. I think if you say keep me logged in, you're crazy. Because anybody who gets on your machine, guess what? They're you. They can send messages as you. They can transfer money if you're logged into your bank account. You should never. I log into everything. Let's put it this way: if it's important enough, they gave you a login page. It means it's not a public site. Don't treat it like a public site. When you say keep me logged in, you've basically turned a private site into a public one. Anybody that jumps on your machine is you, logged in as you, permanently.
I'd also add that there's things such as cookie stealing, where they steal your cookies.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say that. If you do something like a man-in-the-middle attack,
Yep,
can you steal cookies? Like,
you probably can. I can't say I've tried it. So I never stay logged in to these sites. It's a terrible idea.
It's so convenient.
So go home, log out, and log in each time. Okay? But notice also, we said sessions are browser dependent. So just because I was logged in Chrome, even though I'm on the same machine, I have the same IP address, I'm not logged in Firefox. Right? I'm logged in Firefox to Blackboard. As soon as I went to Chrome, I'm forced to log in there. So neither the cookies nor the sessions will transfer from one browser to another. Okay? But generally, as a user, I suggest you always use sessions where you can. And as developers, you might offer that ability to let somebody stay logged in. If ever clients ask me for it, I say, we can do it. I don't recommend it. It's better to make your users log in every time. Okay? If your information is important enough to make them log in the first place, have them do it every time. Otherwise, someone else can easily access their computer much more easily, and they're already logged in. Okay, John, did I answer your question sufficiently?
Kinda. I was wondering how to submit the cookie securely so that it wouldn't just be adding the cookie to the username.
Well, typically, if the cookies are properly written, they're encrypted. So a cookie is just a text file. If you don't encrypt it, it's just going to be plain text.
Right.
Right? So, you know, on Facebook, I'm sure they're not using a plain text cookie. I'm sure they're using some fairly heavy-duty encryption on it. So you would want to encrypt it.
So would MD5, the username along with brand be sufficient?
We'll look at some options. MD5 is certainly one of them. Ryan?
Why would banks save your personal data then? Why would banks save your username and password
I think it's a terrible idea. Like, remember my bank card number so I don't have to type it in?
And then your password.
Terrible idea. I've set mine up. I always do my banking in a private window where it won't remember. So every time, not only do I have to log in, but then I get the security question. Every time I log into my bank, it says, "Is this your computer?" I say no, and prompt me for the security question.
Like using a proxy?
It's not using a proxy, but when you use a private window, if you do private browsing, it won't keep your identity in the cookie. So something that's really secure like your banking, not only as a user should you always do private browsing, but don't have it remember your bank card. Learn your bank card number. Don't have it remember. It's just not secure enough, in my opinion. Okay. All right. So I'll put these are the basics of what you need to know. I will ask you some of these things next week on the midterm, guaranteed. I will certainly ask you what the fact that the web is stateless means, or why we have to store a user identity in a session or cookie. Okay? Is everybody clear on the difference between sessions and cookies? Does anybody have any other questions? No. So we're not going to use cookies at all. We're going to do everything on the server using sessions. The one other thing to keep in mind with sessions, we can store variables in. So sessions is just a built-in collection into any server-side language. Like we have the $post collection, $get. We have $session and cookie collections, which we're going to work with today. We don't want to overload and store too much stuff in the session, and I think, Dan, you may have been hinting at this, because it does take server resources. Okay? So it's okay to store some things in the session. We want to try not to store more in the session than we need to, because it will, over time, start to bog down the server and be a performance hit if we have a big users and tons of session information that travel around with those users. Okay, so we'll want to be mindful of that. To store something like an ID, what else might we want to store in the session object besides the user's ID number? So we know who they are.
Name?
Yeah, we might want their name. So things like on Blackboard, right? We can just print the name in the header. We don't have to query the database on every page. We'll just get it once. What would be the other thing? And we sort of talked about it already here.
Role?
Yeah, what the user's role or permission level is. So what can they do would be something we'll want to check one time when they log in, and then we'll dump that into the session in a variable. So whatever page they're on, we can instantly check who is this user, what are they allowed to do. So we can put multiple values into the session, and then we can check them and read them out at any point. Okay? Okay, so what we're going to do, we'll take a pause here. I'll throw my little Excel file up on Blackboard, so you'll have those notes. You'll have access to them during the midterm. Okay? So when we come back, we're going to make a copy of our week 5 files. We're going to move them into week 6. And then we're going to start going through building out all the stuff you said we needed. We needed a register page, we need a users table, a save register page, login, validate, and then we need a security check here. So we're going to go at a pretty good pace, so take a 10-minute break, not a 20-minute break, because I'd like to have this all done and working and finished so you guys have the full code by the end of class. Okay, so we'll come back at 2 o'clock. I'm going to run and grab a coffee quick.